My parents sued me, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own inheritance. They demanded control of my bank accounts, my car, and even my dog. Their lawyer was smiling right up until the judge read my true asset list, went completely pale, and shouted to stop the hearing and call security immediately. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and tried to destroy your life out of pure greed. I am Erica, 29 years old, and a lead forensic accountant specializing in federal financial crimes. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, my family was obsessed with status. My parents, Calvin and Brenda, cared more about their image at the country club and their standing at our mega church than they ever cared about me. I was always the family disappointment because I chose a quiet life of numbers and logic instead of chasing the shallow glamour they worshipped. But the only person who ever truly saw me was my Aunt Vivian. Today was the hardest day of my life. I had just buried Aunt Vivian, my father's sister, and the only real family I ever knew. She was a self-made billionaire who built her empire from nothing, and she was the only one who saw through my parents' endless lies and financial mismanagement. The funeral service had been exhausting. The damp heat of the Atlanta afternoon clung to my black dress as I stood by her grave watching my parents play the roles of grieving relatives. They squeezed out fake tears for the cameras and church members while whispering about the reading of the will. My sister, Monique, the former beauty queen and ultimate golden child, spent the entire service checking her reflection in her phone screen. Standing next to her was her husband, Trent, a white technology startup founder who constantly used my parents' money to fund his failing business ventures. Trent always carried himself with this unbearable arrogance, speaking over everyone and treating me like an uneducated child simply because I did not wear designer labels or brag about my income. The drive back to my modest apartment was a blur of tears and exhaustion. I drove my reliable 10-year-old Honda Civic, a car that my family constantly mocked me for owning. They believed that success meant leasing luxury vehicles you could not actually afford just to keep up appearances. They were drowning in debt while trying to look wealthy, but I was completely debt-free and building a solid career. Aunt Vivian respected my discipline. She often told me that true wealth whispers, while fake wealth screams. As I parked my car in my regular spot, I could feel the physical weight of grief pulling at my shoulders. My head pounded with a dull ache, and my eyes were swollen from crying. All I wanted to do was walk inside my quiet apartment, take off my heels, and hold my golden retriever Buster. He was my best friend and my only source of comfort right now. I walked up the concrete stairs to the second floor of my building, carrying my purse and the heavy program from the funeral service. The hallway was normally empty and quiet at this time of day, but as I turned the corner toward my door, I stopped dead in my tracks. A group of people stood blocking the entrance to my apartment. It was Calvin, Brenda, Monique, and Trent. They had not even waited for the dirt to settle on Aunt Vivian U.S. grave before coming to my door. They had changed out of their funeral clothes. My mother was wearing a pristine white pantsuit and clutching her expensive leather handbag. My father stood tall, trying to look intimidating with his arms crossed over his chest. Monique was leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. And Trent stood at the very front of the group, holding a thick manila envelope and wearing a smug, victorious smile that made my stomach turn. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and even. I did not want to show them any weakness. I was exhausted and grieving, but I was not going to let them see me break. My mother stepped forward, putting her hand to her chest in a practiced gesture of maternal concern. "Erica, sweetie, we are here because we love you. We are here to help you through this difficult transition. We know you are not well, and we just want to make sure you are protected." I stared at her, trying to process the absolute absurdity of her words. Protected from what I asked, gripping my purse tighter. Trent let out a condescending chuckle and stepped closer, invading my personal space. He always did this, using his height and his privilege to try and intimidate me. "Let us cut to the chase, Erica," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We know about the will. We know Vivian somehow left you $50 million. But we all know a low-level desk worker like you does not have the mental capacity to handle that kind of serious capital. You would blow it all or lose it because you simply do not understand high-level finance. I do. He shoved the heavy manila envelope against my chest, forcing me to take it. I looked down at the label. It was a court summons. I opened the flap and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. My eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the page. It was an emergency petition for a conservatorship. They were suing me for control of my life and my inheritance. You are suing for a conservatorship, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I looked up and met my father's eyes. You are claiming I am mentally unfit. My father did not even have the decency to look ashamed. It is for your own good, Erica, he said, using his deep, authoritative voice that he used to command attention at church meetings. You have always been unstable. You live in this tiny apartment, you drive a junk car, and you do not participate in the family legacy. You clearly do not have the right state of mind to manage $50 million. Trent has the business experience to take over the estate. He will make sure the money is invested properly and protected from your poor judgment. I felt a cold realization wash over me. They had planned this. They had probably been planning this the moment they found out Aunt Vivian was sick. They needed her money to save themselves from whatever financial disasters they had created, and they were willing to legally declare their own daughter insane to get their hands on it. Monique finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes. Oh, please, Erica, do not act so surprised. You know you cannot handle this. Trent is going to put you on a very generous allowance. He said he will give you $2,000 a month. That is more than enough for you to pay rent here and buy dog food for that mutt of yours. You should be thanking us for taking this burden off your shoulders. Trent crossed his arms and nodded as if he were a generous king granting a peasant a piece of bread. Exactly, he said. $2,000 a month is plenty for your lifestyle. And do not worry about your car. Your father is going to take it for now. The judge signed a preliminary order freezing your assets until the hearing, so you are not allowed to make any financial moves or operate vehicles under the estate U.S. name. We cannot have you driving around and causing an accident in your condition. My father stepped forward and snatched the car keys right out of my hand. I let him take them. I did not fight back. I did not scream. I did not cry. My forensic accounting training had taught me one very important lesson. When criminals are digging their own graves, you never interrupt them. You hand them a bigger shovel. My mother reached out and patted my shoulder, her eyes darting around the hallway to see if any of my neighbors were watching. It is okay to be scared, sweetheart, she whispered in a sickeningly sweet tone. We are your family. We are taking the wheel now. Just relax and let the men handle the complicated business. You just focus on getting your mind right. They were so confident. They were so absolutely certain that I was a weak, helpless victim who would just roll over and surrender my entire life to them. They saw my quiet nature as submission. They saw my modest lifestyle as a lack of intelligence. They truly believed that because Trent knew a few startup buzzwords, he was a financial genius, and I was just an uneducated desk worker. They had no idea what a forensic accountant actually did. They had no idea that my entire career was built on dismantling people exactly like them. We will see you in court next week, Trent said, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket. Try not to miss the hearing, Erica. It would look really bad for your mental health evaluation if you failed to show up. Without another word, they turned and walked down the hallway. I stood silently, leaning against my door, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading down the concrete stairs. I listened as the heavy metal door of the apartment building clicked shut. I listened as the engine of my old Honda Civic roared to life and my father drove it away. They had left me standing in the hallway with nothing but the clothes on my back, my purse, and a stack of legal papers declaring me incompetent. Any normal person would have been terrified. Any normal person would have been sobbing on the floor, calling everyone they knew for help. But I was not a normal person, and I was not terrified. I felt a strange sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I unlocked my apartment door and pushed it open. Buster, my beautiful golden retriever, came trotting down the hallway, his tail wagging furiously. He let out a happy bark and pressed his warm head against my legs. I dropped my purse and the thick envelope of court documents onto the entryway table. I knelt down on the hardwood floor, burying my face in his soft fur and letting out a long, slow breath. "We are okay, Buster," I whispered, scratching him behind the ears, just the way he loved. "We are more than okay." I stood up and walked into my small kitchen, pouring myself a glass of cold water. I took a sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my dry throat. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I navigated to my contacts and opened the message thread with my lawyer, Mr. Sterling. He was a ruthless, brilliant attorney that Aunt Vivian had introduced me to years ago. He knew everything about my family, and he knew exactly what was inside the encrypted hard drive Aunt Vivian had left me. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing out a single precise message. They took the bait. They filed the conservatorship papers and took the car. Initiate the decoy protocol. Let them think they have completely frozen my life. Let them think they have won. I hit send and watched the message bubble turn blue. A moment later, 3 dots appeared on the screen as Mr. Sterling began to type his reply. "Protocol initiated. See you in court." I set the phone down on the counter and looked out the window at the setting Atlanta sun. My family thought they had just trapped me in a corner. They thought they had successfully stolen $50 million and stripped me of my independence. But what they did not know was that the money they were so desperately trying to steal was not a blessing. It was a loaded weapon. And by forcing this legal battle by demanding to take legal control of my assets, they had just tied the noose around their own necks. They wanted war, and I was going to give them a massacre. I walked over to the entryway table and picked up the court documents again. Flipping through the pages, I saw the absolute lies they had sworn to under penalty of perjury. There were fabricated statements about me experiencing severe emotional breakdowns. There were claims that I was completely incapable of maintaining basic financial responsibilities. They had even managed to get a signature from a doctor I had never met, stating that I suffered from paranoid delusions. The sheer magnitude of their deception was staggering. It took a special kind of evil for parents to legally declare their own daughter insane just to pay off their debts and fund a white man U.S. failing technology company. Trent U.S. involvement was particularly infuriating. From the day Monique married him, he had treated my family like a charity project that he was magnanimously managing. He would sit at our Thanksgiving table, drinking my father's expensive whiskey and offering unsolicited advice on how Black businesses needed better corporate structuring. My parents ate it up. They worshipped his whiteness and his perceived status as a Silicon Valley innovator. They gave him hundreds of thousands of dollars from their retirement funds to build apps that never launched. He was a parasite draining their resources while convincing them he was their savior. And now he was trying to become my savior too. He wanted to be the legal master of my $50 million inheritance, doling out a pathetic $2,000 a month while he siphoned the rest into his offshore accounts. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I looked at the framed photograph of Aunt Vivian sitting next to my computer monitor. She was smiling brightly, holding a glass of champagne on the deck of her yacht. She had always known my parents were leeches. She had built her wealth through real estate and ruthless corporate acquisitions, and she had spent her last few years secretly gathering every piece of financial dirt on Calvin, Brenda, and Trent. She knew they would come for her money when she died. She knew they would try to crush me. That is why she did not just leave me money. She left me a debt acquisition firm. She left me the very chains that my family had wrapped around their own ankles. I traced the edge of her photograph with my fingertip. "You warned me, Aunt Vivian," I said softly to the empty room. "You told me they would show their true colors before the soil on your grave was even disturbed. You told me to be ready." I opened my desk drawer and ran my hand over the false bottom. Hidden beneath the wood was the encrypted flash drive containing every single ledger, every offshore account number, and every illegal transaction my family had ever made. Trent thought he was fighting a grieving sister-in-law. He did not realize he was fighting a financial assassin who had been studying his every move for 2 years. The battle lines were drawn. The trap was set. My family had demanded control of my life, but by the time I was finished with them, they would be begging the judge to let them escape. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the glow of my computer screen. It was time to get to work. The days following the ambush at my apartment door were eerily quiet. But it was the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating storm. My parents, Calvin and Brenda, did not reach out to me directly. They did not call to check on my well-being or ask how I was coping with the loss of Aunt Vivian. Instead, they went to work doing what they did best. They began to control the narrative. In the affluent African-American circles of Atlanta, reputation is a currency far more valuable than actual money. My parents had spent decades cultivating an image of absolute perfection. My father was an elder at our megachurch, and my mother was the social chair of the most exclusive country club in the city. They knew exactly how to use their influence to destroy mine. The whispers started slowly. A subtle comment dropped during a Sunday school committee meeting. A tragic sigh shared over martinis at the country club lounge. They planted seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone who had known me since childhood. They told our pastor that I was struggling to cope with grief. Then they told the church gossips that my grief had spiraled into dangerous delusions. Within 48 hours, the story had morphed from simple sadness into a full-blown mental health crisis. They implied that I was self-medicating. They used hushed voices to suggest I was suffering from severe addiction and paranoia. My mother was a master at this game. She would ask her prayer circle to keep me in their thoughts, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, while claiming that her heart was completely broken for her sick daughter. I felt the full weight of their smear campaign on a Tuesday afternoon. I had run out of fresh produce and dog food for Buster, so I drove my trusty Honda Civic to the upscale grocery store near my neighborhood. It was a place where half the congregation of our church did their weekly shopping. I wore a simple pair of jeans and an oversized college sweatshirt, mostly because I wanted to be comfortable. I grabbed a shopping cart and headed toward the fresh fruit section, entirely unprepared for the social execution that awaited me. As I was inspecting apples, I noticed Sister Wallace and Deacon Hayes standing near the organic vegetables. They were close family friends, people who had attended my high school graduation and eaten dinner at my parents' home countless times. I smiled and raised my hand to wave at them. Sister Wallace saw me. Her eyes widened and her mouth dropped open slightly. Instead of waving back, she quickly grabbed Deacon Hayes by the arm and pulled him behind a display of imported fruits. They were actively hiding from me. My smile faded. I pushed my cart forward, pretending I had not noticed their blatant avoidance, but as I moved through the aisles, the pattern continued. Women who used to pinch my cheeks and tell me how smart I was now averted their eyes when I walked past. Men who used to shake my hand and ask about my accounting career suddenly found the nutritional labels on cereal boxes absolutely fascinating. The silence was deafening. I could feel their eyes burning into my back the moment I passed them. I could hear the faint sound of their whispers echoing over the gentle background music of the store. "Look at her," one woman whispered to her friend near the dairy aisle. "Brenda told me she is completely unhinged. It is such a shame. She had such a bright future before the drugs took over." I froze, holding a carton of milk in my hand. Drugs. My parents had actually told people I was on drugs. I had never touched a drug in my entire life. I rarely even drank wine. The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood boil. I wanted to drop my groceries, march over to those gossiping women, and scream the truth in their faces. I wanted to tell them that my parents were broke, desperate liars who were trying to steal $50 million. But I remembered my training. I remembered Aunt Vivian telling me that emotion is the enemy of strategy. If I lashed out in the middle of a grocery store, I would only prove their point. I would look exactly like the crazy, unstable woman my parents claimed I was. So I took a deep breath, carefully placed the milk in my cart, and kept my head down. I slumped my shoulders slightly, letting my hair fall over my face to hide my eyes. I gave them exactly what they wanted to see: a broken, defeated woman. Before I could reach the checkout lanes, someone stepped directly into my path. It was Mother Davis, the head of the church prayer ministry. She was a formidable woman wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a judgmental scowl. She did not step aside to let me pass. Instead, she reached out and grabbed my hand, holding it in a vice-like grip. "Erica, child," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire checkout area to hear. "Your mother has been weeping at the altar for your soul. We are all praying that you find the strength to fight these dark demons that have taken over your mind. You need to surrender to your family, child. Let your father guide you out of this darkness." The sheer condescension in her voice was nauseating. She was not offering comfort. She was putting on a holy performance for the audience of shoppers watching us. She was securing her own status by publicly pitying the fallen daughter of Calvin and Brenda. "Thank you, Mother Davis," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and trembly. "I appreciate your prayers." I pulled my hand away, gently, paid for my groceries, and walked out into the warm afternoon air. The moment the automatic doors slid shut behind me, my posture straightened. The timid victim persona vanished instantly. I loaded my groceries into the trunk of my car and climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. The public humiliation was brutal, but it was also a critical piece of evidence. They were establishing a massive documented pattern of defamation. Every lie they told to the community was another nail in their legal coffin. When I arrived back at my apartment, I unpacked the groceries and fed Buster. He nudged his wet nose against my knee, sensing the lingering tension in my muscles. I sat on the living room floor with him, opening my laptop to check my emails. That is when my phone buzzed with a notification from a social media app. It was a link sent by my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, with a simple message attached. "You need to see what your sister is doing online." I clicked the link, which opened Monique's US profile page. Monique had always fancied herself a social media influencer. She spent her days posting meticulously edited photos of her designer outfits, expensive brunches, and luxury vacations, all funded by the debt her husband Trent was desperately hiding. But today, her content had shifted from shallow luxury to toxic victimhood. She had posted a video that already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. In the video, Monique was sitting on the plush velvet sofa in her massive living room. She was wearing no makeup and her hair was tied back in a messy bun, a calculated attempt to look exhausted and raw. She was staring into the camera with tears pooling in her beautiful eyes. "Hey guys," Monique said, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "I have been absent from posting lately because my family is going through an incredibly dark and difficult time. As many of you know, we recently lost our beloved Aunt Vivian. But the grief has completely broken my younger sister Erica." I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched tight. Monique wiped a single tear from her cheek, taking a deep, trembling breath. "Mental illness is so hard," she continued, looking directly into the lens with manufactured sincerity. "It is a disease that destroys families. Erica is refusing help. She is deeply unwell, and she is lashing out at the people who love her most. It has fallen on me and my amazing husband Trent to try and save her from herself. Trent has been an absolute rock, stepping up to manage the legal and medical side of things because my parents are just too heartbroken to function. Please send prayers for my sister. We just want the old Erica back." I slammed the laptop shut. The physical revulsion I felt was overwhelming. Monique was using my fabricated mental breakdown to farm sympathy, likes, and engagement online. She was positioning herself as the tragic, long-suffering sister while simultaneously painting Trent as the white savior rescuing our struggling Black family. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The comments under her video were filled with blind support. People were calling her strong and brave for speaking out about family trauma. They were praising Trent for taking on the burden of a sick sister-in-law. They were completely buying the narrative that I was a lost cause who needed to be controlled. My phone rang, breaking the heavy silence in my apartment. It was Mr. Sterling. I answered on the first ring. "Tell me you secured a copy of that video," I said, my voice sharp and professional. "Downloaded. Archived and time-stamped, Mr. Sterling replied, his deep voice exuding calm confidence. Your family is doing a spectacular job of building our defamation and perjury cases. Their public statements directly contradict the financial realities we hold on that encrypted drive. How are you holding up, Erica? I am perfectly fine. I lied slightly. The grocery store encounter had stung more than I wanted to admit, but I was not going to let emotion dictate my actions. I am just ready to pull the trigger. When do we present the evidence to the judge? Patience, Mr. Sterling cautioned. The legal system requires us to play the game step by step. They filed the emergency conservatorship petition, which granted them temporary freezing powers over your accounts. They expect you to fight the preliminary rulings wildly and emotionally. If you stay quiet, they will grow overconfident. But there is a new development you need to be aware of. What kind of development? I asked, pacing across the hardwood floor. They just filed a secondary motion this morning, Mr. Sterling explained. They are arguing to the judge that because you are severely withdrawn and isolated, you pose a danger to yourself. They want the court to mandate a psychological evaluation, and they are demanding that you be placed under Trent U.S. direct physical supervision for social rehabilitation. They want to force me to spend time with Trent, I asked, stopping in my tracks. Yes, Mr. Sterling said. And the judge, being cautious with emergency petitions, has agreed to a compromise. A courier is on his way to your apartment right now with a mandatory court order. My blood ran cold. A court order for what? To prove that you are not a danger to yourself and to satisfy the judge, as preliminary requirements, you must demonstrate that you can function in a social setting under the supervision of your proposed temporary guardian. Mr. Sterling said. The order mandates that you attend the Crystal Horizon Charity Gala this Saturday evening, and you must be escorted by Trent. The Crystal Horizon Charity Gala was the most prestigious event of the year for Atlanta, U.S. Black elite. It was the exact place where my parents and Monique derived all their social power. It was a room full of politicians, wealthy business owners, and megachurch leaders. They want to parade me around like a captured animal. I realized my voice dropping to a whisper. They want to show the entire city that Trent has me on a leash. They want everyone to see me subdued and broken to justify their legal takeover. Precisely, Mr. Sterling agreed. If you refuse to go, you violate a direct court order giving them grounds to force a psychiatric hold. If you go and cause a scene, they will use your behavior as proof of your mental instability. It is a highly calculated trap, Erica. I walked over to the large window looking out over the city skyline. The sheer arrogance of their plan was breathtaking. Trent thought he could put me in a designer dress, walk me into a ballroom full of millionaires, and play the role of the benevolent guardian saving his crazy sister-in-law. He thought he had me completely cornered. He did not know that I already knew about the $15 million he owed to private loan sharks. He did not know that I knew my parents had illegally leveraged their retirement accounts to keep his fraudulent company afloat. He thought he was walking into that gala as a king, but he was actually walking into a room full of people who would drop him the second they realized he was broke and facing federal prison. I will go to the gala, I told Mr. Sterling, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. Are you sure? He asked, sounding slightly concerned. Trent will provoke you. Your mother will try to humiliate you. It will be a psychological gauntlet. I am a forensic accountant, I reminded him. I spend my life reading the fine print that destroys arrogant men. Let Trent put on his tuxedo. Let my mother wear her pearls. Let Monique record all the videos she wants. I will play the quiet, medicated sister perfectly. I will give them enough rope to hang themselves in front of the entire city. Mr. Sterling chuckled softly. I will review the terms of the court order and make sure they do not try to overstep their boundaries during the event. Keep your head down, Erica. I ended the call just as a sharp knock echoed from my front door. I looked through the peephole to see a man in a delivery uniform holding a thick legal envelope. I opened the door, signed for the package, and carried it into my kitchen. Inside was the official court mandate bearing the seal of the Superior Court. It outlined the exact terms of my required attendance at the charity gala, including a strict schedule of when Trent would arrive to pick me up and assume his supervisory role. It was a legal document designed to humiliate me and strip away my autonomy. I laid the papers flat on the kitchen island right next to the photograph of Aunt Vivian. She had attended that same gala every year, not to show off, but to quietly donate millions to scholarships. She despised the fake socialites and the greedy opportunists who used the event to stroke their own egos. "They think they are punishing me," I said aloud, touching the embossed seal on the court document. Buster trotted over and nudged my hand, offering his silent support. I looked down at my faithful dog, my mind racing with the possibilities of the upcoming night. They wanted me to attend the biggest social event of the year under the strict supervision of the very man who was trying to steal my $50 million inheritance. They wanted me silent, compliant, and broken. I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would attend the gala and I would let Trent supervise me. But by the time the final champagne glass was emptied, the high society elite of Atlanta would know exactly who was truly in control. The smear campaign was about to face a very harsh reality. The Crystal Horizon Charity Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's U.S. most opulent hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden light over the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Trent had arrived at my apartment exactly at 6:00 to collect me. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had handed me a list of rules before I even stepped out of my doorway. I was not to speak unless spoken to. I was to agree with whatever medical narrative my mother presented. I was to stand slightly behind him at all times to demonstrate his supervisory role. I wore a simple floor-length black dress with no jewelry and very little makeup. I kept my gaze lowered and let my shoulders slump forward slightly. When I climbed into the back of his leased SUV, I made sure my hands trembled just a fraction. Trent looked at me through the rearview mirror and smirked, visibly satisfied that he had broken me. He had no idea that my silence was not submission, it was surveillance. Walking into that ballroom was like stepping onto a theatrical stage where everyone knew their lines except me. The moment we walked through the double doors, my mother Brenda swooped in. She wore a shimmering emerald gown that hugged her figure perfectly. She immediately hooked her arm through mine, pulling me close. "Oh, Erica, sweetheart," she cooed loudly enough for the mayoress wife to hear. "I am so glad Trent was able to get you out of the apartment. We are going to have a beautiful, safe evening." I just nodded blankly, playing the part of the over-medicated, unstable daughter to perfection. Trent immediately went to work. He paraded me around the room like a captured trophy. He introduced himself to Black business owners and wealthy investors, using his white privilege and an endless stream of Silicon Valley buzzwords to command the room. He talked about disrupting markets and scalable infrastructure while sipping expensive scotch. He would inevitably pull me forward, wrapping a heavy arm around my shoulders, and tell the investors about the tragic burden of managing his severely ill sister-in-law. He painted himself as a benevolent savior, taking time away from his highly successful tech startup to manage my daily care. The investors ate it up. They praised his character. They offered him business cards. My father Calvin stood nearby, chest puffed out, proudly accepting compliments on his son-in-law's outstanding moral fiber. It was a sickening display of coordinated gaslighting. But behind my blank stare, I was analyzing everything. I noticed the slight tremor in my father's hands when someone mentioned the current economic downturn. I noticed how Monique kept checking her phone every 3 minutes, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. The cracks in their perfect facade were starting to show. After 2 hours of being paraded around and subjected to my mother's fake doting, I felt a genuine headache building behind my eyes. My mother was in the middle of a tearful performance for the head of the hospital board, describing my imaginary delusions, when I gently pulled my arm away. "I need to use the restroom," I mumbled, staring at the floor. My mother sighed heavily, but nodded. Trent grabbed my wrist, squeezing it tightly. "5 minutes, Erica," he hissed under his breath. "Do not make me come looking for you." I nodded meekly and slipped away through the crowd. The Women Us restroom was a sanctuary of marble and gold fixtures. It was completely empty when I walked in. The heavy oak door closed behind me, blocking out the pulsing bass of the jazz band playing in the ballroom. I walked past the row of gilded sinks and went straight to the very last stall in the corner. I locked the door, lowered the toilet lid, and sat down, pulling my knees to my chest. I just needed a moment of silence to recalibrate my thoughts. The air conditioning hummed quietly. I closed my eyes, running through the financial data Aunt Vivian had left me, mentally matching the offshore account numbers to the shell companies my father had set up. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the restroom burst open, hitting the wall with a violent thud. Sharp, angry footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Someone was breathing heavily. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath in the last stall. "You are out of your mind," Monique hissed, her voice tight with panic. "You cannot pitch those investors out there, Trent. Not when we are drowning like this." I heard the sound of water running from a sink and Trent cursing under his breath. "I do not have a choice, Mo," he snapped. His carefully cultivated tech bro charm was completely gone, replaced by raw desperation. "The bridge loan is due in 4 days. 4 days, Monique. If I do not show them that new capital is coming in, they are going to start breaking things, and they will not start with my office equipment." My heart began to race. I pulled my feet further up onto the seat of the toilet, making absolutely sure they could not be seen from under the stall partition. I pressed my ear against the cold marble wall to hear every word. Monique let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. $15 million, Trent. 15 million. How did you let it get this far? You told me the algorithm was ready. You told me we were weeks away from a massive buyout. It was a fake demo, Trent growled, splashing water on his face. The software never worked. It was just a shell to secure the initial funding, but the developers bailed when the checks bounced. The private lenders you set me up with your father, your shady friends from Chicago, they do not care about software delays. They care about their return with 20% interest. Calvin gave you everything, Monique cried, her voice echoing off the tile. My dad emptied his entire retirement fund to bail you out last month. He leveraged the house. He leveraged the church accounts. If the IRS audits him right now, he goes to federal prison. We all go to prison. Then shut up and play your part, Trent hissed violently. I could hear him grab her because she let out a sharp gasp. This is why we need, Erica declared, incompetent by next week. Vivian, us 50 million is the only thing that can clean this up. The second the judge signs that conservatorship order over to me, I am wiring 15 million to the Chicago guys to save our knees. Then I am paying off your father us tax fraud, and we are using the rest to disappear. But Erica is not crazy, Monique whimpered, sounding genuinely terrified now. What if she fights back? What if Sterling has a trick up his sleeve? Trent let out a cold, nasty laugh. Your sister is a pathetic little desk worker. She folded the second I took her car keys. Did you see her out there tonight? She is a beaten dog. The judge will look at her, look at me, and hand over the keys to the kingdom. We just have to keep the Chicago guys at bay until the ink dries on that court order. I sat in the stall, my blood turning to ice. It was worse than I had imagined. Trent was not just a failed businessman. He was a fraud who had borrowed $15 million from violent loan sharks. My father, Calvin, a respected church elder, had committed massive tax fraud and embezzled church funds to save his white son-in-law, U.S. fake company. They were not just greedy. They were cornered animals facing prison time and mob violence. Aunt Viviana's $50 million was literally their ransom money. I need to text them, Monique said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. I need to tell them the conservatorship is a sure thing. I need to buy us until Friday. I heard the rustle of a purse being frantically dug through. Do not use your main phone, Trent snapped. Use the burner. If the feds are already looking at your dad, U.S. accounts, they might be sweeping our metadata. My hands were trembling as I carefully reached into my small clutch to turn on my phone, U.S. recording app. This was the smoking gun. This was the exact confession I needed. But as I fumbled with the screen in the dark stall, I heard a sharp clatter. Monique had dropped something. A heavy black burner phone hit the marble floor and slid across the smooth tiles. I watched in absolute horror as it slid straight under the partition gap of my stall, coming to a complete stop right next to my black heels. The restroom went dead silent. The sound of the jazz band outside seemed to fade away. Trent's breathing stopped. "Someone is in here," he whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal, chilling register. I stared at the burner phone by my foot, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I saw the shadow of Trent's dress shoes approach the partition. He was standing right outside my stall door. "Who is in there?" Trent demanded violently, rattling the locked stall handle. "Open the door!" I had nowhere to go. There were no windows. There was no other exit. Trent took a step back, and I knew he was preparing to kick the door off its hinges. I clutched my phone tightly, staring at the lock as the shadow outside prepared to strike. The heavy silence in the restroom was broken only by the sound of my own erratic heartbeat as I stared at the black burner phone resting near my shoe. I had less than a second to react before Trent kicked the door off its hinges. My mind raced through the forensic training I had received. Panic is a liability. Action is survival. I quickly pushed the burner phone back under the partition, sending it sliding across the floor until it hit Monique Yu's shoe. Then I dropped to my knees, leaned over the toilet bowl, and forced myself to gag violently. The loud, echoing sound of my fake retching filled the marble bathroom just as Trent slammed his fist against the stall door. "Open this door right now," he roared, his voice echoing off the tile. I unlocked the latch and let the door swing open. I remained on the floor, clutching my stomach and shivering, playing the part of the heavily medicated, unstable woman to absolute perfection. I looked up at them with half-closed eyes, taking short, shallow breaths. "I am sorry," I murmured, my voice weak and trembling. "The medication my mother gave me, it makes me so sick to my stomach. I just needed to throw up." Trent stopped dead in his tracks, his fists still clenched. His eyes darted from my pale face to the toilet and then down to the burner phone resting near Monique's feet. Monique quickly snatched the phone off the floor, shoving it deep into her designer clutch. The sheer relief washing over their faces was almost comical. They truly believed I was just a pathetic, sick woman who had spent the last 10 minutes vomiting instead of listening to their entire criminal conspiracy. Trent let out a disgusted sigh and stepped back, smoothing the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. "Look at you," he sneered, his lip curling in contempt. "You are a complete mess, Erica. Clean your face and get out of here. We are leaving this gala immediately before you embarrass this family any further." I nodded meekly, pulling myself up and leaning heavily against the stall partition. "Yes, Trent," I whispered, looking at the floor. "I am so sorry to be such a burden." Monique rolled her eyes and marched out of the restroom, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Trent grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the exit. The drive back to my apartment was silent and suffocating. Trent drove aggressively, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Monique sat in the passenger seat, frantically typing on her main phone, no doubt trying to do damage control with her social circle. I kept my head resting against the cold glass of the window, watching the city lights of Atlanta blur past. I was playing the defeated victim, but inside my mind was a fortress of calculating precision. I had everything I needed to destroy them, but the legal trap was not fully set yet. I had to wait for the deposition. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness. I spent my time in my modest apartment finalizing the encrypted files and preparing for the upcoming legal battles. Buster, my loyal golden retriever, was my constant companion. He would rest his heavy head on my lap while I typed, reminding me that I had something real and pure in my life while my family chased dirty money and hollow status. His presence was the only thing keeping me grounded in a reality that felt increasingly hostile. It was Tuesday morning when the quiet sanctuary of my home was violently shattered. I was sitting on the living room rug brushing Buster's golden fur when a loud, aggressive pounding echoed from my front door. Buster let out a low, protective growl, standing up and placing himself between me and the entrance. His instincts were sharp, and he knew something was wrong. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. My stomach dropped into my shoes. It was my mother, Brenda, and my brother-in-law, Trent. But they were not alone. Standing behind them were two uniformed officers from County Animal Control, holding a heavy-duty capture pole and a metal transport cage. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, keeping my foot firmly planted against the base. "What is the meaning of this?" I asked, my voice tight with suppressed anger. My mother pushed the door open with surprising force, using her designer handbag as a wedge to force her way inside. She stepped into my apartment with a look of manufactured pity on her face. "Erica, darling, we are doing this because we love you," she cooed loudly, making sure the animal control officers could hear her theatrical performance. "We know how much you are struggling with your mental health, and we simply cannot allow an innocent animal to suffer in an unstable environment. We have to do what is best for everyone." Trent stepped in behind her, holding a stack of official-looking papers. His eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "We are here for the dog, Erica," he stated coldly, projecting his false authority. "As your temporary legal conservators, we have a fiduciary duty to eliminate liabilities and ensure your living conditions are safe. Your psychiatric evaluations clearly state that you are unfit to care for yourself, let alone a large, demanding animal. The court agrees with us." I stared at the papers in his hand, recognizing the emergency removal order. They had actually gone to a judge and argued that my fabricated mental illness made me an animal abuser. It was a level of psychological warfare that went beyond simple greed. They were trying to break my spirit by taking the only living creature that loved me unconditionally. They knew Buster was my lifeline and they wanted to sever it. One of the animal control officers stepped forward, looking slightly uncomfortable, but bound by the legal paperwork in his hand. "Ma, and we have an order to remove the animal from the premises," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Please secure the dog so we can transport him safely and without incident." Buster sensed the threat. He backed away, letting out a sharp bark and standing protectively by the kitchen island. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but my mind remained ice cold. I knew exactly what this was. This was an extortion tactic, pure and simple. They did not care about Buster. They cared about the $50 million, and they were using my dog as leverage to force my hand before the legal proceedings advanced any further. Trent leaned in close to me, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that the officers could not hear over Buster barking. "This can all go away right now. Erica," he hissed, his breath warm and foul against my cheek, "sign the voluntary relinquishment forms. Sign over the entire inheritance to me today, before the trial, and I will tell these officers there was a massive misunderstanding. You can keep the mutt. You can keep your pathetic little apartment. Just give me the money and you will never see me again." I looked at Trent. His face flushed with desperate arrogance. He was sweating slightly around the collar. The pressure from the Chicago loan sharks was clearly breaking his composure. He needed the $50 million today because he knew he might not survive until the end of the week if he did not pay them back. He was acting out of pure primal desperation. I looked at my mother, who was standing near the door, inspecting her manicured nails as if destroying her daughter. Yes, life was simply a tedious errand she had to check off her to-do list. There was no maternal instinct left in her, only an empty shell fueled by a desire to maintain her country club status. If I fought them right now, they would call the police. They would claim I was having a violent psychotic episode. They would use it to cement their conservatorship case forever, and I would be locked in a psychiatric ward while they drained Aunt Viviana's accounts. I had to play the long game. I had to swallow my pride and let them take him. I walked over to Buster, dropping to my knees on the hardwood floor. Tears stung my eyes, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, they were completely genuine. I wrapped my arms around his thick neck, pressing my face into his warm fur. "It is okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice breaking as I held him tight. "Be a good boy. I will come for you. I promise you I am coming for you, Ming. I clipped the heavy nylon leash onto his collar and stood up, handing the loop to the officer. Buster whined, planting his paws firmly on the floor, refusing to move away from me. He looked back at me with wide, confused brown eyes that tore at my soul. My chest physically ached with the pain of letting him go. The officer gently tugged the leash, guiding my reluctant dog out of the apartment and down the hallway toward the transport cage. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace, offering me a patronizing smile. "It is for the best, Erica," she said smoothly, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You need to focus on your healing right now, not cleaning up dog hair. We will take very good care of him at the shelter until you are ready to make the right financial decisions for your future." Trent tapped the relinquishment papers against his palm, staring at me with a victorious sneer. "Think about it, Erica," he said. "The clock is ticking. You have until the deposition tomorrow to sign these papers and give me control. If you do not, you will never see that dog again. And I will make sure the judge locks you in a facility for the rest of your miserable life." They turned and walked out, leaving me standing alone in the deafening silence of my apartment. The door clicked shut. The deadbolt engaged. I stood perfectly still in the entryway, listening until I was absolutely sure their footsteps had faded down the stairs and they had left the building. The tears that had been welling in my eyes instantly evaporated. The performance was over. The timid, broken victim was gone. The forensic accountant was back. They thought taking Buster would break my mind. They thought removing my only source of comfort would force me to surrender $50 million out of sheer emotional desperation. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They thought they were playing a game of emotional blackmail with a weak-minded girl. They did not realize they had just declared war on a woman who dismantles criminal empires for a living. I walked across the living room, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I moved past the kitchen island and stopped in front of the large built-in bookshelf that spanned the entire back wall of my apartment. It was filled with old textbooks, accounting manuals, mystery novels, and framed photographs. I reached out and grasped the edges of the middle shelf, pressing a hidden latch concealed behind a stack of thick encyclopedia volumes. The heavy wooden shelf clicked and swung outward on silent hinges, revealing a reinforced steel wall safe hidden perfectly within the drywall. I punched in a complex 12-digit alphanumeric code and placed my thumb firmly on the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door unlatched with a soft mechanical hiss. Inside the safe there was no cash. There were no jewels or physical valuables. There was only a small black protective case. I pulled the case out and popped the metal clasps, flipping the lid open. Resting inside on custom-cut foam was a military-grade encrypted hard drive. It was the exact drive Aunt Vivian had given me 2 years prior, right before her health began to rapidly decline. I carried the drive to my desk and plugged it into my secure offline laptop. I entered a series of long passphrases and decryption keys, bringing the massive database to life. Rows upon rows of financial ledgers, offshore account, routing numbers, forged tax documents, and wire transfer receipts flooded my screen. This was the culmination of Aunt Vivian's life work. She had spent years quietly buying up the shadow debt of Atlanta, U.S. corrupt elite. And right at the top of the list were the highly classified files detailing Trent U.S. $15 million debt to the Chicago mob alongside my father, Calvin. U.S. embezzlement of church funds to cover Trent U.S. interest payments. I stared at the glowing screen, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. Trent and Brenda wanted to play psychological warfare. They wanted to steal my dog to force my hand. They had no idea that I held the digital execution order for their entire lives right here on my desk. I reached out and traced the edge of the hard drive with a perfectly steady hand. I smiled coldly, the corners of my mouth lifting into a sharp, calculating grin. "You took the wrong dog from a forensic accountant," I whispered to the empty room. The morning of the deposition arrived with a heavy gray, overcast sky that perfectly matched the cold, sterile interior of the downtown law firm. The conference room was a massive expanse of mahogany and glass designed specifically to intimidate. I walked in wearing a cheap oversized beige cardigan and faded slacks, keeping my shoulders hunched and my eyes glued to the floor. My lawyer, Mr. Sterling, walked beside me carrying a modest leather briefcase. He looked tense, his jaw tight as he pulled out a chair for me at the long table. Across from us sat the firing squad. Trent had hired a team of high-priced, aggressive corporate litigators. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Holloway, wore a pinstripe suit and a predatory smile. Next to him sat my parents, Calvin and Brenda, playing their parts flawlessly. My mother wore a modest pearl necklace and held a tissue tightly in her hands, looking every bit the heartbroken mother. Calvin sat with his hands folded, staring at me with deep manufactured pity. And then there was Trent. He leaned back in his leather ergonomic chair wearing a custom navy suit, grinning like a lottery winner who had already cashed his ticket. The court reporter started the recording, and Mr. Holloway began his assault. He did not ease into the questioning. He immediately launched a barrage of aggressive inquiries designed to make me panic. He asked about my daily routine, my living conditions, and my financial history. I answered in a small, trembling voice. I kept my hands clasped tightly in my lap, making sure they shook just enough for everyone in the room to notice. I stuttered over my words, pausing frequently to look at Mr. Sterling with wide, terrified eyes. Then Holloway brought out the centerpiece of their fraudulent case. He slid a thick medical file across the polished mahogany table. The seal on the front belonged to a private psychiatric clinic. Holloway leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and locked his cold eyes on me. "Erica," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have sworn affidavits from a licensed medical professional outlining a severe history of paranoid delusions and cognitive decline. This report, signed by Dr. Harrison, clearly states that you suffer from acute financial anxiety and an inability to distinguish reality from paranoid fantasies. It says here that you have neglected your basic needs and cannot manage simple household bills." I stared at the fake medical file, my heart maintaining a slow, steady rhythm, while my outward appearance crumbled into perfect panic. They had actually paid off a doctor to write a fabricated psychiatric evaluation. It was a bold criminal move. I let a single tear escape and roll down my cheek. I reached up with a shaking hand to wipe it away. "I do not know what that is," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I just pay my rent and go to work. I do not have delusions." Trent chuckled loudly, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table. His arrogance was suffocating. "Oh, come on, Erica," he interrupted, ignoring the standard rules of a deposition. "You can barely balance a checkbook. You live in a dump and drive a car that belongs in a scrapyard. How can you possibly expect a judge to believe you can handle complex asset management?" Mr. Sterling raised a hand, objecting to Trent's outburst, but Holloway just waved it off, letting his client continue the psychological beatdown. "We are talking about $50 million here." Erica, Trent continued, using his hands to emphasize his words like he was giving a presentation to gullible investors. "This is not a savings account. This requires an understanding of diversified portfolios, liquidity management, offshore tax structures, and EBITDA margins." Do you even know what those words mean? You are a low-level desk worker. You count paper clips for a living. I looked down at my lap, biting my lip to keep from smiling. He was using basic entry-level finance terms to try and intimidate a senior forensic accountant. It was like watching a toddler try to explain physics to a rocket scientist. But I played my role. I shrank back into my chair, shaking my head slowly. "I just look at spreadsheets," I mumbled defensively, letting my voice waver. "I just organize the files my boss gives me. I do not know about offshore things. Aunt Vivian just said she was leaving me her estate." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sob, pressing the tissue to her face. "Oh, my poor, sweet baby," she cried out, leaning against Calvin. "She does not even understand what is happening. She is so confused, Calvin. We have to help her." Calvin wrapped a comforting arm around her, shooting me a look of deep disappointment. "We are trying, Brenda," he said solemnly. "We are doing everything we can to save her from herself." The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. They were sitting in a legal deposition, actively participating in a massive fraud, trying to steal my entire life, and they were playing the victims. Holloway took control of the room again, tapping his gold pen against the fake medical file. The fact is, Erica, you are in no condition to manage a massive financial windfall. You are displaying signs of extreme distress right now, simply being asked basic questions about your capacity. Your brother-in-law Trent has extensive experience managing high-yield capital. He runs a highly successful technology firm. He has the acumen and the stability to protect this money while you seek the intensive psychiatric help you so clearly need. I let out a small whimper, pulling my oversized cardigan tighter around my body. I do not need a hospital, I pleaded, looking frantically at Mr. Sterling. Please tell them I do not need to go to a hospital. I want my dog back. Please just tell them to give Buster back to me. Trent smiled, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. He thought he had completely shattered me by taking my dog. He thought bringing up Buster would send me into a full emotional tailspin, proving his point to the court reporter typing every word of my breakdown. Your dog was living in squalor, Erica Trent said coldly. Animal control agreed with us. If you want him back, you need to cooperate. You need to show the court that you are willing to let the adults handle the complicated things. I buried my face in my hands, letting my shoulders shake with silent fake sobs. Inside, my mind was running through the final calculations of the trap I had spent days setting. I had built a labyrinth of financial data so dense and so legally binding that once Trent signed his name to it, he would never see the light of day again. I just needed Holloway to ask the final question. I needed him to demand the bait. Holloway leaned back in his chair, sensing blood in the water. He exchanged a confident look with Trent. They believed they had successfully established my complete incompetence on the legal record. Now it was time for them to secure their prize. Erica, look at me. Holloway commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. I slowly lifted my head, keeping my eyes wide and tearful. You claim that your Aunt Vivian left you this estate? Holloway said, pressing the attack. But your own medical records show you suffer from severe financial delusions. You cannot even articulate what a diversified portfolio is. So let us clear this up for the record. Holloway placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning in closely. I want you to tell us exactly what you think this $50 million inheritance actually consists of. What do you believe you own? This was the moment, the pivot point of my entire operation. I blinked rapidly, looking around the room like a trapped animal. I do not know, I stammered. I just have the list she gave me. She sent me a list before she died. She told me it was everything. Trent sat up straight, his eyes locking onto mine like a predator spotting wounded prey. A list, he asked, his voice tight with sudden intense interest. What kind of list? I looked at Mr. Sterling. My lawyer played his part with absolute perfection. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking very nervous. He reached out and placed a hand over his briefcase, as if trying to protect whatever was inside it. Objection, Holloway, Mr. Sterling said, his voice lacking its usual steady confidence. My client is clearly distressed. Any documents left to her by the deceased are privileged and not relevant to her current mental state. We are not prepared to submit a full inventory of assets at this preliminary stage. Holloway saw the hesitation in Mr. Sterling's eyes. He saw a lawyer realizing his client was a sinking ship. Holloway pounced on the opportunity. It is absolutely relevant to her mental state, Sterling Holloway countered aggressively. If she is carrying around a delusional list of fake assets, it proves our entire case. We have a right to see what she believes she is inheriting to establish her detachment from reality. Hand it over. Trent nodded eagerly, pointing a finger at my lawyer. Give us the list, Sterling. If Erica is legally incompetent, we have a right as her acting emergency conservators to review all documents pertaining to the estate. You cannot hide it. Mr. Sterling looked at me, his brow furrowed in feigned panic. Erica, he whispered loud enough for the microphone to pick up. I strongly advise against this. We have not properly vetted these documents. I shook my head violently, gripping the edge of the table. No, I cried out, my voice echoing in the large room. Give it to them. Just give it to them so they leave me alone. I want them to see it is real. Aunt Vivian said it was real money. Please just let them see it so I can go home and get my dog back. Mr. Sterling let out a heavy, defeated sigh. He opened the brass latches of his leather briefcase with slow, reluctant movements. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, bound document. It was over 200 pages long, filled with dense spreadsheets, routing numbers, corporate charters, and heavily redacted acquisition ledgers. He placed it on the mahogany table, keeping his hand resting on top of it. This is highly irregular, Holloway, Mr. Sterling warned, his voice tight. My client is acting under extreme emotional duress. Holloway snatched the document out from under Mr. Sterling's U.S. hand with a triumphant smirk. Emotional duress is why we are here, Sterling. We need to see exactly what kind of fantasies your client has been entertaining. Holloway flipped open the heavy cover of the bound document, his eyes eagerly scanning the first page, expecting to find hand-drawn doodles or erratic ramblings of a delusional woman. Instead, he found a wall of dense, perfectly formatted financial data line. After line of corporate entity, names, routing protocols, and tiered asset classifications stared back at him. The smug grin on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a slight furrow of his brow, as he tried to process the sheer volume of information presented before him. Calvin and Brenda leaned forward in their leather chairs, trying to catch a glimpse of the pages, but Holloway shielded the document, pulling it closer to his chest. This was not the diary of a sick mind. This was a meticulously crafted financial ledger. Holloway turned the pages slowly, the crisp sound of the heavy paper echoing in the silent boardroom. I sat perfectly still, keeping my breathing shallow and my hands clasped tightly together. My eyes darted nervously between Holloway and Trent, acting as though I was terrified of the numbers on the pages. Trent could not handle the suspense any longer. He pushed his chair back and stood up, walking over to Holloway and looming over his shoulder. What is it? Trent demanded, his voice tight with greedy anticipation. Is the money there? Is it liquid? This was my opening. The precise moment I had calculated for days. I let out a soft, pathetic-sounding hiccup and looked up at Trent with wide, tear-filled eyes. Trent, please, I whimpered, my voice shaking so badly I almost convinced myself I was truly terrified. Please, you have to help me. I do not understand any of it. Aunt Vivian gave it to me, but there are so many numbers and big words, and it makes my head hurt. I just want my dog back. Trent, you said. You know how to handle high-level finance, you said. You understand all of this. Please just look at it and tell them it is real money so I can go home. The effect of my words on Trent was instantaneous. His chest puffed out and a look of absolute supreme satisfaction washed over his face. He looked at my parents, who were nodding encouragingly at him, playing perfectly into his white savior complex. Then he looked back at me, the pathetic, helpless black woman begging for his superior intellect to save her from the scary numbers. He reached down and pulled the heavy document right out of Holloway U.S. hands. Ignoring the lawyer's slight protest, "Let me see this, Erica," Trent said, using a slow, patronizing tone like he was talking to a simple child. "Do not worry your pretty little head about it. I will translate this mess for you." He walked back to his seat, holding the document, like it was the Holy Grail. He dropped it onto the mahogany table with a heavy thud and began flipping through the pages. His eyes widened as he saw the initial summary pages, detailing the gross valuation of $50 million. He saw the clean asset columns. He saw the words capital gains and liquid holdings. But because his ego was entirely blinding his intellect, he did not look closer. He did not read the fine print. He did not flip to the back half of the binder where the complex appendices lived, where the true nature of the debt acquisition firm was buried under layers of convoluted corporate structuring. He just saw the $50 million bottom line, and his desperate, debt-ridden mind took over, completely overriding any basic business sense. Holloway reached a hand out, wanting the document back. Trent, we should review this privately before making any statements on the record, Holloway cautioned. We need our own analysts to verify the origin of these accounts and trace the corporate entities before we attach your name to them. But Trent waved him off completely, dismissing his own highly paid legal counsel. There is nothing to review, Holloway. Trent boasted, his voice loud and commanding, ensuring the court reporter caught every single syllable. This is exactly what we have been looking for. It is a comprehensive asset portfolio left by Vivian. It is extremely complex. Yes, far too complex for someone in Erica's diminished mental state to comprehend. She just admitted herself that the numbers make her head hurt. She is begging for my help because she knows I am the only one in this room qualified to manage an estate of this staggering magnitude. I let out a small sob, nodding my head in agreement. Yes, Trent. I just do not know what to do with it. Calvin and Brenda exchanged a look of pure triumph. My mother brought her tissue to her face, hiding a vicious, cruel smile. She thought she had won. She thought her brilliant son-in-law had just secured their salvation and guaranteed their continued country club lifestyle away from the prying eyes of the IRS. Mr. Sterling shifted in his seat, playing the nervous, outmatched lawyer perfectly. He leaned toward the microphone and spoke with a hesitant, stuttering tone. Mr. Holloway, please caution your client. We submitted that document under extreme protest. We do not concede that Mr. Trent has any legal right to assert control over those specific assets today. This is highly irregular, and we reserve the right to contest any fiduciary claims before the judge. That was exactly what Trent needed to hear. He needed to feel like Sterling was trying to keep the money away from him. He needed to feel like he was winning a hard-fought battle against a stubborn defense attorney. Trent slapped his hand down hard on the table, shutting Sterling up. I am the acting emergency conservator by order of the court. Trent declared, his face flushing with arrogant, unearned power. Erica has just surrendered this document to me and asked for my professional help. I am stepping in as her fiduciary right now to protect these assets from your mismanagement, Sterling. Trent looked directly at the court reporter, making sure her hands were flying across the keyboard, typing every single arrogant word he spat out. I want it on the record that I am taking immediate physical and legal possession of this asset list under my authority as emergency conservator. I understand the financial structures outlined in this document, and I am officially claiming fiduciary responsibility for all assets listed herein to protect them for the estate going forward. Holloway looked genuinely panicked now. Trent, do not state that you understand the document until we have a forensic team look at it, Holloway urged, leaning close and lowering his voice. You are swearing under oath to take responsibility for unknown financial instruments. You do not know what liabilities are attached to these holding companies. I do not need an accountant, Holloway. Trent snapped his desperation to secure the $50 million, overriding every ounce of common sense he possessed. I run a tech firm. I manage millions in venture capital. I know what I am looking at. I am taking responsibility today, so Sterling cannot try to hide this money before the full trial. Next week, I want a signature-page Holloway draft and addendum right now, stating that I have reviewed the provided inventory, and I accept full fiduciary duty over it. As the acting conservator, my heart beat a slow, steady rhythm of absolute victory. My breathing remained calm and shallow. My hands still trembled for the audience. But inside, I was perfectly flawlessly still. Trent was practically begging to put his head in the guillotine. He was so terrified of the Chicago loan sharks waiting for their $15 million repayment, so desperate to pay off his debt before they broke his legs, that he was forcing his own lawyer to legally bind him to a document he had barely skimmed. Holloway, visibly sweating and looking like a man who knew he was driving a car off a cliff, pulled a blank legal addendum from his leather briefcase. He hastily scribbled out the terms Trent had just loudly demanded. He read it aloud, stating that Trent, in his capacity as temporary conservator, acknowledged receipt of the asset list, understood its complex contents, and assumed full legal and fiduciary responsibility for the items contained within it. Holloway pushed the paper across the mahogany table, sliding a pen next to it. Trent did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He grabbed his expensive gold pen and signed his name with a messy, arrogant flourish. He pressed so hard, the pen nearly tore through the thick legal paper. He slid the signed addendum over to the court reporter to be officially entered into the record, and then he slammed the thick asset list shut, pulling it firmly to his side of the table. "The deposition is concluded for today," Trent announced, standing up and adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Do not worry, Erica. You did the right thing today. The adults are in charge. Now we will see you at the final hearing next week. Maybe if you behave yourself and stay properly medicated, I will buy you a new dog to replace the one you lost." My parents stood up alongside him. Calvin buttoned his suit jacket, looking incredibly pleased with himself, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. Brenda did not even bother to fake a goodbye tear for her supposedly heartbroken daughter. She just turned on her heel and followed Trent out the heavy wooden doors. Holloway gathered his files, looking deeply troubled as he trailed behind them without saying a word. The doors clicked shut, leaving Mr. Sterling and me completely alone in the massive, chilling boardroom. The silence stretched out for a long, heavy moment. The court reporter had stopped typing, packed up her equipment, and quietly slipped out through a side door, leaving us to ourselves. Once I was absolutely certain the room was empty, and no one was lingering in the hallway, the violent trembling in my hands instantly stopped. I dropped the hunched, defeated posture, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep, slow breath of the cool, conditioned air. My face returned to a blank, calculating mask, stripping away every ounce of the pathetic victim I had just played. Mr. Sterling slowly reached up and loosened his tie, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. His hands were actually shaking a little bit, not from fear, but from the sheer unbelievable magnitude of what had just legally occurred in front of his eyes. He looked across the mahogany table at the empty leather chairs where my family had just been sitting, and then he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. "Erica," Mr. Sterling whispered, his voice tight with absolute disbelief. "Are you sure about this? He just legally claimed ownership of everything on that list. He swore under oath that he understands it and takes full fiduciary responsibility for all of it." I looked at the empty space on the table where Trent had just signed his life away with a gold pen. I picked up my cheap beige cardigan, folding it neatly and methodically over my arm. I met Mr. Sterling, a nervous, sweating gaze with eyes as cold as winter ice. That was exactly the point. The final hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the Superior Court of Fulton County. The building felt like a mausoleum, built of polished oak and cold marble. We were in courtroom 4B under the presiding authority of Judge Harrison. Judge Harrison was a man with a fearsome reputation in Atlanta. He was a strict, no-nonsense jurist who had spent 30 years on the bench, and he had a particular soft spot for protecting vulnerable individuals from financial abuse. My family had clearly done their research. They knew exactly which judge they wanted to manipulate. They knew that if they played the roles of terrified, heartbroken protectors, Judge Harrison would hand them the keys to the kingdom without a second thought. I walked into the courtroom wearing a faded gray dress that hung loosely over my frame. My hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the floor. Mr. Sterling walked beside me, guiding me to the defense table with gentle, practiced concern. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, making sure my shoulders were hunched forward. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table looked like a casting call for a luxury lifestyle magazine. My father, Calvin, wore a somber charcoal suit, sitting with his back perfectly straight. My mother, Brenda, wore a conservative but incredibly expensive navy blue dress, clutching a lace handkerchief in her hands. Monique sat behind them in the gallery, wearing minimal makeup to look stressed and exhausted. And then there was Trent. Trent sat right next to Mr. Holloway, looking like the absolute master of the universe. He wore a subtle smirk that he tried to hide behind a mask of serious concern whenever the judge looked his way. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison took his seat at the high bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of files Holloway had submitted. The judge let out a heavy sigh, looking from the paperwork over to me. His eyes were filled with a deep, heavy pity. He already believed their story. He had read the fake psychiatric evaluation they purchased. He had read the asset list that Trent had so eagerly signed. The trap was set perfectly. Mr. Holloway stood up and began his opening remarks. He painted a tragic, devastating picture of a brilliant young woman whose mind had simply collapsed under the weight of the real world. He used words like tragic decline and severe detachment from reality. He told the judge that Aunt Vivian had made a grave mistake by leaving $50 million to a woman who could not even remember to feed her own dog. Holloway was a masterful storyteller, and he had the entire courtroom captivated. Then the parade of perjury began. Calvin was the first to take the stand. The bailiff swore him in, and my father placed his hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the whole truth under the eyes of God and the law. I sat there listening to the man who raised me commit a federal felony without a single ounce of hesitation. Calvin spoke in a low, rumbling voice that cracked with manufactured emotion. He told Judge Harrison about how I used to be a bright, happy child, but how I had slowly withdrawn into a dark, paranoid shell over the last few years. He lied about coming to my apartment and finding me sitting in the dark talking to walls. He lied about me refusing to pay my bills. He told the court that he and Brenda had tried everything to get me psychiatric help, but that I was too far gone to accept it. I watched his hands resting on the wooden railing of the witness stand. They were completely steady. He was not nervous. He was putting on a performance that he had rehearsed 100 times in front of his bathroom mirror. He looked directly at the judge and said that giving me control of $50 million would be equivalent to handing a loaded weapon to a toddler. He pleaded with the court to grant the conservatorship to Trent, stating that Trent was a brilliant technology founder who possessed the financial literacy necessary to secure the family legacy. Every word was a lie. Every sentence was another count of perjury. My mind filed each statement away, cross-referencing his testimony against the digital ledgers sitting in the evidence box. He was burying himself alive, and he thought he was building an empire. When Calvin stepped down, Brenda took his place. If my father was aiming for an Oscar, my mother was aiming for a Lifetime Achievement Award. The moment she sat in the witness chair, the tears began to flow. They were silent, graceful tears that streamed down her carefully powdered cheeks. She gripped her lace handkerchief like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Mr. Holloway asked her to describe my living conditions, and Brenda launched into a masterclass of emotional manipulation. She wept as she described my small apartment, calling it a squalid, dangerous environment. She claimed that she had to force her way inside just to make sure I was still breathing. And then she brought up Buster. She told the judge that when she and Trent went to rescue my golden retriever, the dog was emaciated and terrified. She said I was starving my own dog because I was too lost in my delusions to remember to feed him. That specific lie sent a hot spike of genuine rage straight through my chest. Buster was my world. His coat was shining. His weight was perfect, and he had a better diet than most humans. They had stolen my dog to use as a prop in their sick psychological game. But I did not let the anger show on my face. I simply lowered my head further, letting my hair shield my eyes, making it look like I was shrinking away from the shame of her testimony. Brenda looked up at the judge, her voice trembling perfectly. "Your Honor," she sobbed gently, "I am terrified for my daughter. I do not care about the money. I just want my little girl to be safe. Trent has been a godsend to this family. He has stepped up to manage her affairs because my husband and I are just too heartbroken to do it ourselves. Please, Your Honor, let Trent take over so we can finally get Erica the inpatient help she so desperately needs." She stepped down from the stand, dabbing her eyes and returning to Calvina's side. Judge Harrison was visibly moved. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands, looking at me with an expression of profound sorrow. He was a good man who genuinely thought he was watching a family desperately trying to save a broken woman. He had no idea he was watching a pack of wolves trying to slaughter a lamb. But the plaintiffs were not done yet. Mr. Holloway called Monique to the stand. Monique strutted up to the witness box wearing a modest beige dress that was completely out of character for her usual flashy style. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Monica's angle was different from our parents. Where they played the heartbroken caretakers, she played the terrified victim. Holloway asked her about the events leading up to the conservatorship petition, and Monique began weaving a story of absolute fiction. She claimed that she had come to my apartment 2 weeks ago to bring me groceries. She told the court that when she walked in, I completely snapped. She testified that I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed her into a corner, screaming paranoid delusions about how the family was trying to poison my food. She forced out a few tears, her voice quivering as she described how she had to run out of the apartment in fear for her life. She told the judge that I was violent, unpredictable, and completely detached from reality. She said she had nightmares about the look in my eyes that day. It was blatant aggressive perjury. Monique had not been to my apartment in over a year. The only time she ever contacted me was to ask for money or to complain about Trent Youth's failing business. But she sat there under oath in a court of law and painted me as a violent psychopath. I sat in silence, taking the abuse. I listened as my own flesh and blood stripped away my humanity, my dignity, and my sanity for the sake of $50 million. They were so thoroughly convinced of their own superiority that they did not even consider the possibility that they were being allowed to speak. They thought my silence was proof of my defeat. They thought Mr. Sterling sitting quietly beside me taking minimal notes was proof that my legal defense had completely collapsed. They did not know that I had explicitly instructed Mr. Sterling not to cross-examine them. I told him to let them speak uninterrupted. I wanted every single lie permanently etched into the court transcript. I wanted them to feel entirely untouchable. The higher they built their pedestal of lies, the more devastating the fall would be. Trent sat at the plaintiff's table, watching the entire spectacle with a look of supreme boredom mixed with greedy anticipation. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, calculating how long it would take for the judge to sign the final order, so he could run to the bank and wire $15 million to the Chicago mob. He thought he was hours away from salvation. He was already planning his victory dinner. Monique finished her testimony and stepped down, walking back to the gallery with her head bowed. The courtroom was thick with heavy, oppressive silence. The performance had been a spectacular success. Holloway stood up and confidently informed the court that the plaintiffs rested their case. He did not even try to hide his victorious smile. Judge Harrison let out a long, slow breath. He looked down at the documents on his bench, adjusting his glasses. The atmosphere in the room felt entirely finalized. The judge looked over at the defense table, his eyes resting on my hunched, trembling form. The pity in his gaze was almost suffocating. He saw a tragedy. He saw a woman whose mind had failed her, and a family making the difficult but necessary choice to institutionalize her. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, his voice gentle but carrying the heavy authority of his position. The court has heard the testimony of the plaintiffs. We have reviewed the psychiatric evaluation and the asset inventory that Mr. Trent has legally bound himself to manage. Given the overwhelming nature of the testimony regarding your client, a severely diminished capacity and violent tendencies, does the defense have any witnesses to call before I make my ruling? The judge was giving us a formality. He had already made up his mind. He was ready to sign my life away to Trent. Calvin and Brenda leaned forward in their seats. Monique held her breath in the gallery. Trent actually picked up his expensive gold pen, getting ready to sign the final transfer documents. Mr. Sterling stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at the judge, and then he looked down at me. This was the moment. The entire charade, the weeks of humiliation, the stolen dog, the grocery store whispers, all of it had been building to this exact fraction of a second. I stopped trembling. I unclasped my hands. I rolled my shoulders back, dropping the hunched, defeated posture I had maintained for weeks. I lifted my head, and for the first time since walking into that courtroom, I looked directly at Trent. The smug, victorious grin on his face faltered just a millimeter as he saw the sudden, terrifying clarity in my eyes. I pushed my chair back, the sound of the wooden legs scraping against the marble floor echoing loudly in the silent room. I stood up perfectly straight. The timid, broken aura vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating presence of a lead forensic accountant. Mr. Sterling looked at the judge with a calm, professional expression. "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Sterling said, his voice echoing clearly across the courtroom. "The defense calls exactly one witness." I stepped out from behind the defense table, smoothing the wrinkles of my faded dress. I looked past my stunned parents, past Holloway's suddenly confused face, and locked eyes with Judge Harrison. "I will testify, Your Honor." The courtroom fell completely silent as I made my announcement, my voice cutting through the heavy air with absolute clarity. Mr. Holloway shot to his feet immediately, his face flushed with sudden panic. "Objection." "Your Honor!" he shouted, gesturing frantically toward me. "We have extensive medical documentation proving that the respondent is suffering from severe delusions. She is in no state to testify under oath. This is highly prejudicial." Judge Harrison frowned, looking down at the paperwork in front of him and then back at me. He seemed torn between his desire to protect a vulnerable woman and his duty to hear all sides of a case before he could rule on the objection. Trent suddenly stood up at the plaintiff's table, placing a firm hand on Holloway's shoulder. "Your Honor," Trent said, projecting his voice so it echoed impressively in the large room. "If Erica wants to testify, we should let her speak her truth. My wife and I have nothing to hide. We are here simply to help her. But before she takes the stand, I would like to testify first. I believe my testimony will provide essential context regarding the complexity of the estate and why a professional conservator is absolutely necessary." Holloway looked at Trent like he had just grown a second head. He grabbed Trent's arm, whispering furiously, but Trent shook him off with an arrogant smirk. Trent was a narcissist of the highest order. He had sat there listening to Calvin and Brenda play the emotional victims, and Monique play the terrified sister. But Trent wanted the spotlight. He wanted to be the hero who saved the day with his brilliant business acumen. He wanted the judge to look at him and see a Silicon Valley genius who was graciously stepping in to manage a messy Black family U.S. problems. Judge Harrison considered the request for a moment. "Very well, Mr. Trent," he ruled. "You may take the stand first. Miss Erica, you will have your opportunity to testify immediately afterward." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Mr. Sterling leaned close to me, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "He is walking right into it," Sterling murmured. "Yes," I replied softly. "He cannot help himself." Trent strode confidently to the witness box, wearing his tailored navy suit. Like a suit of armor, he placed his hand on the Bible and swore the oath, flashing a charismatic smile at the judge. When he sat down, he exuded the kind of effortless entitlement that only comes from a lifetime of failing. Upward. Holloway approached the podium, looking deeply uncomfortable with this unplanned deviation from their strategy. "Mr. Trent Holloway began carefully. Can you describe your relationship with the respondent and your professional qualifications for assuming the role of conservator over an estate valued at $50 million? Trent leaned into the microphone, clasping his hands together. "Well, Your Honor, as you have heard, this family has been through a devastating tragedy. Erica has always been a quiet, troubled girl, and losing her aunt has unfortunately pushed her over the edge into complete cognitive failure. My father-in-law, Calvin, came to me desperate for help. He knows that I run a highly successful technology firm specializing in scalable infrastructure and venture capital. Acquisition. Managing complex portfolios is what I do every single day." He paused, letting the impressive-sounding buzzwords hang in the air, ensuring the court reporter captured every syllable. "When Calvin asked me to step in," Trent continued, his voice dripping with faux humility, "I knew I had a fiduciary duty to protect this family from financial ruin. $50 million is not a standard checking account. Your Honor, it requires an understanding of tax mitigation, offshore diversification, and aggressive yield management. An entry-level desk worker like Erica, even on her best day, does not possess the basic financial literacy to comprehend these mechanisms. Letting her retain control would be a dereliction of our duty to protect her. Trent was giving the performance of his life. He painted himself as the ultimate savior, a brilliant entrepreneur who was sacrificing his valuable time to rescue a family that was drowning in their own incompetence. The arrogance was so thick you could choke on it. He actually turned and offered me a small, pitying smile. Holloway, seeing that the judge was nodding along with Trent, U.S. testimony decided to push the advantage forward. And what steps have you taken to secure these assets? Mr. Trent, the lawyer asked. Trent sat up straighter. This was his crowning moment, the part where he proved to the court that he was already in total control. Your Honor, during the deposition yesterday, Erica was highly distressed. She admitted she could not understand the documents left to her. She essentially begged me to take control. Recognizing my superior expertise, I reviewed the comprehensive asset inventory provided by her legal counsel, and I immediately assumed emergency fiduciary responsibility to protect those assets from mismanagement. Trent reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pristine folded document. He held it up for the judge to see. I have here the signed addendum from the deposition, Your Honor, he declared proudly. I have legally sworn under penalty of perjury that I understand the contents of the asset list, and I accept full and absolute legal responsibility for the entire estate. This ensures that the funds are locked down, safe from Erica U.S. erratic behavior, and completely under my professional supervision. I submit this signed inventory and my declaration of fiduciary duty into evidence, Your Honor. Holloway looked like he was going to be sick. He knew that entering that document into evidence bound Trent to it forever. But he was powerless to stop his client from grandstanding. Judge Harrison accepted the document from the bailiff, looking it over carefully. You understand, Mr. Trent? The judge asked, his voice grave, that by entering this into evidence and asserting full conservatorship, you are taking absolute legal liability for all assets, debts, and financial instruments contained within this inventory. Trent smiled confidently, completely oblivious to the trap snapping shut around his ankles. Absolutely, Your Honor. I stand fully behind my signature. I am prepared to manage every single item on that list. Calvin and Brenda let out a simultaneous sigh of profound relief. In the gallery, they thought it was over. They thought Trent had just locked in the $50 million and saved them from the Chicago mob. And the IRS, Monique, was actually smiling, looking at Trent with pure adoration. Thank you, Mr. Trent, Judge Harrison said, setting the document aside. You may step down the court. Calls Erica to the stand. Trent stood up, buttoning his jacket, and stepped out of the witness box. He walked back to the plaintiff's table, puffing his chest out. He shot me a victorious sneer as he passed, expecting me to be trembling in my cheap cardigan. He expected a broken, defeated woman to drag herself up to the stand and sob incoherently, cementing his victory. Instead, I stood up, moving with a fluid, precise grace. I let the oversized cardigan slip off my shoulders, letting it pool on my chair underneath. I was wearing a sharply tailored dark gray suit that fit me perfectly. I rolled my shoulders back instantly, shedding the hunched, timid posture I had maintained for weeks. I walked to the witness stand, the sharp click of my heels echoing in the sudden heavy silence of the courtroom. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore the oath, my voice ringing out clear, strong, and completely devoid of any emotion. I sat down in the witness chair, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I folded my hands on the wooden railing and looked directly at Judge Harrison. I did not look at Trent. I did not look at my parents. They no longer mattered. They were just variables in a resolved equation. Judge Harrison looked at me, adjusting his glasses. He was visibly taken aback by the sudden transformation in front of him. Miss Erica, he began hesitantly. Before we proceed, the court must ask. Are you aware of the psychiatric evaluation submitted by the plaintiffs claiming you suffer from severe delusions and an inability to grasp reality? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice cool and even. I am aware of the document, Dr. Harrison. The signatory of that evaluation has never met me, examined me, or spoken to me. The plaintiffs transferred $75,000 from Calvin U.S. remaining retirement account to a shell company owned by Dr. Harrison, precisely 4 days before that evaluation was filed. I have provided the routing numbers and wire transfer receipts to Mr. Sterling, who has already submitted them to the district Attorney U.S. office. The courtroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Holloway leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward. Objection, Your Honor, he bellowed, sounding genuinely panicked. These allegations are baseless and have no place in a conservatorship hearing. Overruled. Judge Harrison snapped his eyes, narrowing as he looked at the defense table. The judge turned back to me, his expression shifting from pity to intense, sharp focus. Miss Erica, you are making serious allegations of fraud and perjury under oath. I am a lead forensic accountant, specializing in federal financial crimes. Your Honor, I stated calmly, my eyes never wavering from the judge. Tracking illicit capital flow is my profession. I do not make allegations. I provide verifiable data. Trent us. Smug smile vanished completely. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at me like I had just materialized from thin air. Calvina's face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. Brenda gripped her handkerchief so tightly her knuckles were white. Judge Harrison leaned forward, steepling his fingers. The plaintiffs have asserted that you lack the financial literacy to manage a $50 million estate inherited from your Aunt Vivian. They claim you are overwhelmed by the complexity of the assets. I am not overwhelmed. Your Honor, I replied, my voice carrying a lethal quiet authority. The estate left to me by my late aunt is not a standard trust fund containing liquid cash or real estate portfolios. It is an active, heavily layered debt acquisition firm operating under the parent entity, Obsidian Holdings. My aunt spent the last 5 years of her life purchasing shadow debt, toxic liabilities, and compromised offshore ledgers. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the panic begin to spread through the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, I continued, I ask that you turn to Appendix B of the asset inventory that Mr. Trent just enthusiastically submitted into evidence. The very same document he just swore under oath to fully understand and take absolute fiduciary responsibility for. Judge Harrison reached for the thick bound document Trent had provided. He flipped past the summary pages, past the clean asset columns, tearing deep into the dense complex appendices that Trent had completely ignored. The judge ran his finger down a specific page, his eyes moving rapidly behind his glasses. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the axe to fall. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, crushing, and heavy with impending doom, the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic collapse. Judge Harrison stared at the dense pages of Appendix B, his hands visibly shaking as the sheer magnitude of the financial data registered in his mind. He slowly took off his reading glasses, setting them down on the heavy wooden bench with a sharp click that echoed across the massive room. He looked at Trent, and all the pity, all the judicial sympathy he had harbored just moments ago evaporated completely, replaced by a chilling look of absolute horror and disgust. Mr. Trent, the judge began, his voice low and tight with suppressed rage. You sat in that witness box and swore under penalty of perjury that you reviewed this document. You swore that you understood its contents completely and that you possessed the superior financial literacy required to manage it. Is that correct? Trent shifted in his expensive tailored suit, the first beads of nervous sweat forming on his forehead. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face all morning began to melt away, leaving behind a mask of sudden, frantic confusion. He looked over at Holloway, expecting his high-priced lawyer to intervene and save him. But Holloway was frozen, staring at the judge with a rising sense of panic. Yes, Your Honor, Trent stammered. His Adam. Us, apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. I understand the asset structures. I am a technology founder. I know how to manage capital. Judge Harrison slowly closed the thick binder, the heavy thud of the cover sounding like a coffin slamming shut. Then you must be an incredibly foolish man, Mr. Trent. The judge said, his words dropping like stones into the quiet room. Because these are not assets. You have not claimed ownership of a fortune. You have just legally chained yourself to an anchor at the bottom of the ocean, and you have thrown away the key. I stood up straighter in the witness box, resting my hands on the smooth wooden railing. The timid, broken aura I had projected for weeks was entirely gone, replaced by the icy, calculating precision of a woman who dismantles criminal empires for a living. I turned my gaze directly to Trent, who was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what was happening. Your Honor, I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly to every corner of the courtroom. The plaintiffs assumed that my late Aunt Vivian left me a traditional portfolio of stocks, bonds, and liquid cash. They saw the $50 million valuation on the summary page, and their unadulterated greed completely blinded them to the reality of what that number actually represents. They were so eager to declare me insane and steal my inheritance that they did not bother to read the fine print. I let those words sink in, watching the color drain entirely from my father, Calvin. Us face. Brenda gripped the edge of the wooden pew, her knuckles turning stark white. Monique sat frozen in the gallery, her eyes darting between me and her husband. Aunt Vivian did not leave me $50 million in liquid cash. Trent, I explained, keeping my tone clinical and relentless. She left me a massive, heavily layered debt acquisition firm operating under a secure corporate umbrella for the last 2 years of her life. My aunt used her vast resources to quietly purchase the shadow debt, toxic liabilities, and compromised offshore ledgers of Atlanta, U.S. corrupt elite. She bought the rotting foundations of fraudulent enterprises, and she packaged them into a single legally binding corporate entity. Trent grabbed the edge of the plaintiff's table, his knuckles turning white as he leaned forward, breathing heavily. His mind was desperately trying to catch up, trying to decipher the trap he had just sprinted into. She bought the $15 million bridge loan you took from those private lenders in Chicago. Trent, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, precise pitch. I watched his entire body flinch as if he had been physically struck. The lenders who are demanding their repayment by the end of this week. The violent men who do not care about your fake software algorithm or your empty promises, they only care about the 20% interest you owe them. And because Aunt Vivian purchased that debt, the entity demanding that massive repayment, the entity that holds the power to destroy your life, is now the estate you just fought so desperately to control. A strangled gasp echoed from the gallery. Monique stood up, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She looked at Trent, shaking her head back and forth, refusing to believe that her luxurious lifestyle was built on a foundation of mob debt and lies. And she did not stop with Trent. I continued, turning my piercing gaze to my parents. Calvin shrank back into his seat, the respected church elder crumbling into a pathetic shell of a frightened man. She audited, "Your accounts, Calvin." She traced the funds you embezzled from the church offerings to bail out your son-in-law. When his checks started bouncing, she found the secondary mortgages you illegally took out on properties you do not even own. She bought the compromised offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands where you tried to hide the money laundering trails. She legally packaged every single instance of your tax evasion, your wire fraud, and your corporate theft into this highly classified portfolio. The courtroom was paralyzed. The court reporter, us. Fingers flew across the keys, capturing every damning word, building a permanent federal record of their absolute ruin. Holloway was staring at the closed binder on the Judge U.S. bench, as if it were a live bomb ready to detonate. His mouth opened and closed silently, but no sound came out. He was realizing the catastrophic scope of what he had just helped his client submit into the court record. "You see, Trent?" I said, leaning forward slightly. "The $50 million valuation you saw on the first page of that document is not liquid cash. It is the gross calculated value of the criminal liabilities, the shadow debt, and the fraudulent accounts owed by you and Calvin to the estate. You thought you were stealing a fortune to pay off your lenders and save yourselves from federal prison. But what you actually did was far worse than simply confessing to your crimes. I pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the signed addendum resting next to the judge's gavel when you demanded to be my conservator. When you stood in that deposition room and forced your lawyer to draft that specific addendum, you were not just asking for access to my bank accounts. When you signed that paper with your expensive gold pen swearing under penalty of perjury that you understood and accepted full fiduciary responsibility for this inventory, you made a legally binding, irrevocable declaration. I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring the absolute gravity of my next words landed with maximum impact. You did not just claim ownership of the assets, Trent, I stated coldly. You claimed ownership of the liabilities. You formally and legally transferred the burden of $15 million in mob debt entirely onto your own shoulders. You assumed direct legal liability for multiple counts of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and embezzlement. By signing that paper as the acting fiduciary and submitting it to this judge under oath, you confessed to this court and to the federal government that these debts and fraudulent accounts belong to you, and that you alone are solely responsible for paying them back and facing the criminal consequences. The realization hit the plaintiff's table like a massive physical shock wave. Trent let out a high-pitched, panicked sound, grabbing his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He tugged frantically at his expensive silk tie, trying to loosen it as he gasped for air. His custom navy suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the judge to his lawyer, to the armed bailiffs standing near the walls. Monique started sobbing hysterically in the gallery, her loud wailing filling the massive room. She dropped to her knees, clutching the wooden pew, as the reality of their complete financial and legal ruin washed over her. They were not getting $50 million. They were getting 15 years in a federal penitentiary and a lifetime of insurmountable debt. Holloway leaped out of his chair, moving so fast he knocked it backward onto the polished marble floor with a loud crash. His face was purple with rage and absolute terror. He realized that by drafting that addendum and submitting it into evidence, he had just facilitated a massive federal confession on the open record, and his own law license was now in severe jeopardy. "Your Honor," Holloway screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "The plaintiff withdraws the petition. We withdraw the conservatorship." Motion immediately. My client was manipulated by the defense. The defense engaged in highly deceptive practices. We demand to strike the addendum from the record right now. I looked at Holloway with an icy, unwavering smile. You cannot strike a sworn fiduciary declaration from the record. Mr. Holloway, your client demanded that document. He demanded to sign it. He stood in that witness box just 5 minutes ago and testified under oath that he possessed the superior financial literacy required to manage this exact portfolio. He cannot claim ignorance now just because he was too arrogant to read the fine print before trying to steal my life. Calvin and Brenda finally woke up from their state of paralyzed shock. They looked at each other, and the horrifying truth settled over them like a thick, suffocating blanket. They were not just completely broke. Their entire pristine country club reputation was annihilated. Their church members would find out they were thieves. The Internal Revenue Service would seize everything they owned. They were going to federal prison, and they had handed the evidence over themselves. Brenda let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping her delicate lace handkerchief to the floor. She grabbed Calvin's arm, her carefully maintained high society facade completely shattering. "We have to go, Calvin," she shrieked, her voice echoing violently in the cavernous room, pulling frantically at his suit jacket. "We have to get out of here right now. They are going to lock us up." Calvin stumbled out of his pew, his eyes wide with blind primal terror. He shoved past the people sitting in the gallery, nearly knocking an older woman to the floor as he dragged Brenda behind him. They were frantically trying to reach the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, trying to run away from the devastating, inescapable trap they had built for themselves out of their own boundless greed. Holloway was grabbing his files, shoving them haphazardly into his leather briefcase, desperately trying to distance himself from Trent, who was now weeping openly at the plaintiff's table. His face buried in his hands, shaking uncontrollably as his entire fake empire collapsed around him. Judge Harrison stood up from the high bench, his face dark with righteous fury and absolute zero tolerance for the chaos unfolding in his courtroom. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block with a deafening, violent crash that echoed like thunder. "Nobody leaves! Judge Harrison!" roared his voice booming across the room with terrifying authority, stopping Calvin and Brenda dead in their tracks, mere inches from the exit. "Bailiffs, lock those doors, call the United States Marshals and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Immediately, everyone at that plaintiff's table is detained, pending a full federal inquiry into conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. Nobody takes another step in my courtroom." I stood perfectly still in the witness box, watching the armed bailiffs move swiftly to block the heavy oak doors, placing their hands on their utility belts. The panic, the screaming, the tears. None of it touched me. I had walked into this building as a hunted animal, and I was leaving as the apex predator. My family wanted to take everything from me. They wanted to leave me with nothing but a fake diagnosis and a broken heart. Instead, they had given me the ultimate victory, and I did not even have to break a single law to achieve it. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom remained firmly sealed as Judge Harrison ordered the bailiffs to secure the perimeter pending the arrival of the United States Marshals. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating reality of what had just transpired. The frantic energy of my family had dissolved into sheer animalistic panic. Trent was hyperventilating at the plaintiff's table, his face a pale, sweaty mask of terror. He looked wildly at Monique, who was still sobbing in the gallery, perfect composure completely shattered by the weight of their impending ruin. "I did not do this alone!" Trent suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at his wife. "Monique knew everything. She set up the private lenders. She is the one who forged the initial corporate documents to get the bridge loan. She is just as guilty as I am." Monique gasped, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute betrayal. "You coward!" she screamed back at him, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "You promised me this was foolproof. You said my sister was too stupid to stop us." It was a beautiful, pathetic display of thieves turning on each other the moment the ship began to sink, their unified front built on a foundation of white privilege and high society. Arrogance crumbled into dust as they desperately tried to throw each other under the bus. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom finally swung open and a team of federal marshals marched down the center aisle, their dark suits and stern expressions bringing a chilling finality to the scene. Calvin and Brenda were ordered to step forward. My father, the respected church elder who cared so deeply about his community, standing, held his hands out, his wrists shaking violently as the cold metal handcuffs clicked into place. My mother, Brenda, the queen of the country club, stumbled forward, her designer heels scuffing against the polished floor. The marshals read them their rights, citing federal perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and financial embezzlement. I stepped down from the witness box, smoothing the wrinkles from my gray skirt. As I watched the marshals process the arrests, the side door of the courtroom clicked open and an animal control officer walked in, holding a familiar red nylon leash. Buster let out a sharp, joyful bark the moment he saw me pulling against the leash. With all his might, the officer handed the leash to a court bailiff who brought my beautiful golden retriever right over to me. I dropped to my knees, burying my face in his soft, warm fur. He licked my cheek, whining happily, completely unaware of the absolute destruction taking place around us. As the marshals began to haul the prisoners toward the holding cells, Brenda dug her heels into the floor, stopping just a few feet away from where I knelt with Buster. Her makeup was a ruined mess of black streaks, and her eyes were wide with a desperate pleading terror that I had never seen before. "Erica, please," she cried out, her voice hoarse and broken, trying to reach her handcuffed arms out toward me. "You cannot let them take us away. We are your family. We share the same blood. You have to fix this. Please, sweetheart. You have to save us." I slowly stood up, keeping one hand resting gently on Bustero's head. I looked at the woman who had happily handed me over to a fake psychiatric ward just hours prior, who had stolen my dog to force me into signing away my life. There was no warmth left in my chest for her. No lingering childhood attachment. No desire for reconciliation. "You said I was crazy, Mom," I replied, my voice flat, cold and completely devoid of any emotion. "You testified under oath that I was completely detached from reality. I guess you should not have trusted a crazy person. Us money." I turned my back on her before she could even process the finality of those words. Her wails echoed down the long marble corridor, fading away as the heavy doors swung shut. The courtroom was finally quiet, leaving just me, Mr. Sterling, and Judge Harrison, who looked down at me from his high bench with a slow, respectful nod. The trap had snapped shut perfectly, and the nightmare was finally over. 6 months later, the humid Atlanta summer had faded into a crisp, bright autumn. I sat in my new corner office on the 40th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise. The heavy glass door bore my name in frosted letters right above the title: Lead Forensic Financial Consultant. The view from my desk stretched for miles over the city skyline, a constant reminder of the heights I had reached. The fallout from the trial had been swift and merciless. The federal investigation triggered by Judge Harrison, U.S. Order, uncovered a staggering web of corruption that took down half of Calvin U.S. associates. Calvin and Brenda U.S. sprawling mansion had been foreclosed on by the bank, their luxury cars repossessed, and their country club memberships permanently revoked. Calvin was currently serving an 8-year sentence in federal prison for embezzlement and tax evasion, while Brenda received 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. Trent got the worst of it the moment the Chicago lenders realized his assets were seized by the feds and his company was a sham. They cut their losses and cooperated with the prosecution for leniency. Trent was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for massive wire fraud, perjury, and attempting to manipulate the court. Conservatorship process. Monique avoided prison by turning state U.S. evidence against her own husband, but she was left completely bankrupt, currently working double shifts at a local diner and living in a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of town. I never visited them. I never answered the letters they sent from prison, begging for forgiveness or financial help. The boundary I drew in that courtroom was made of iron. They had chosen their path. They had dug their own graves out of pure greed and entitlement. I just provided the shovel. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, taking a sip of hot black coffee. Buster let out a happy sigh from his orthopedic bed near the window, basking in a square of afternoon sunlight. My assistant walked in, placing a stack of new corporate audit requests on my desk. Clients who wanted the absolute best in financial protection. I did not have $50 million in liquid cash. I never did. Aunt Vivian, U.S. gift was not money. It was the ultimate weapon. A masterclass in leveraging the greed of arrogant people against themselves. She had given me the power to strip away everything from the people who had tried to destroy me without breaking a single law. The timid, broken girl they tried to erase was gone forever. The family that had treated me like a disappointment had been completely removed from my world. All that remained was the quiet, steady truth of numbers and the unshakable peace of knowing I had won. I patted Buster's head and opened the first file, letting the numbers tell their story. The most powerful lesson from Erica's journey is that true strength lies in silent preparation and unbreakable boundaries. When toxic relatives try to manipulate or exploit you, reacting with pure emotion only gives them ammunition. Instead, channel your pain into building undeniable independence and expertise. Erica did not win by screaming. She won by letting their greed and arrogant entitlement become their absolute ultimate downfall. You never owe loyalty to people who view you as just a disposable asset. Your worth is not defined by those who constantly underestimate you. Protect your peace, trust your intellect, and let facts speak. If this story of ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments.